Well, I've been thinking a lot about how things have changed since I focused a lot on writing about restoration. And in 2003, I published a book called Nature by Design. And it was an essay about restoration, I think one of the early monographs that looked at restoration. And I argued for a particular inclusive view of restoration that was integrated across both ecological and social dimensions. And restoration was simpler back then. That's what I find kind of funny, and what I speak about with my students these days is that restoration existed in a simpler time back in 2003 or almost 20 years ago. And we had the idea that historical reference conditions were what we achieved or obtained in order to guide what we did with restoration. So that was simple in a sense. I mean, it might vary, it might be hard to do it, but that was kind of the guidepost. And ecological integrity was a clear and appropriate goal for restoration. But I look back on it now and I think sometime around 2003, I don't know, maybe it was a little earlier, a little later, was the end of what I call classical ecological restoration. So classical ecological restoration being defined primarily by an ecological focus and one in which historical references were key. But shortly after that, all hell broke loose in restoration in so many different ways. We notably, the awareness and the study of climate change in relation to restoration projects and how it is that we deal with shifting targets. We became more aware of the significance of invasive species, however we want to think about those and however we want to call them. Invasive species, invasion biology, evasion ecology was coming into its own around the time restoration ecology was, so the two were similar. And the idea of persistent invasive species that are difficult to eradicate became a prominent feature in a lot of restoration projects. We are also seeing a shift in cultural values too, and that took place notably in response to the 2005 document that set out ecosystem services for the first time. So that was that great millennium assessment that took place and had huge repercussions for restoration ecology was something that really got people thinking about ecosystem processes being a kind of service to humanity that we could then quantify and make economic. And these are huge changes. These are big changes, and it's hard for restoration to kind of accommodate those and come to terms with them. So we started doing it in a number of different ways, a number of different responses. People working in restoration all around the world were trying to come to terms with these things in different ways. So one significant response was a concern over what happens when you have ecosystems that become practically unrestorable as a consequence of climate or particular types of human disturbance or invasive species or any number of other intersecting drivers of change that cause an ecosystem to be really resistant to restoration. And we're seeing this more and more. And we started coming to grips with it. A whole bunch of people getting together starting, in the 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s, and then it kind of becoming concrete in around circa 2009 with the idea of novel ecosystems. These are ecosystems that comprise new functions or new species arrangements or both, and that they become unrestorable. So there were lots of responses occurring. And at the same time, I think we were seeing lots of people trying to try out different things that made sense within their regions or their parts of the world that were not necessarily orthodox restoration either, not at least the way that the Society for Ecological Restoration thought of restoration and the way that I thought of restoration at the time, and how we, produced documents like the original SCR primer in 2001 and watch that trajectory of that guidance go out and inform how restoration is being practiced for a while. But it started becoming a little bit ragged not too many years later with all of these different changes. Sure. Well, this is, a significant change, and we can talk more about this in terms of where restoration is heading, but I think the idea of restoration being equitable and inclusive is critical. And we, in Canada, where we have many Indigenous peoples representing diverse cultural lifeways and language groups, have endured enormous deprivation and changes not only in their cultural way of life, but also the landscapes, the lands and waters that they depend on. And this has been a devastating story in the 20th and early 21st century. Though there's a lot of attention being given, thankfully, to what restoration can contribute to some of the reconciliation activities that are underway with Indigenous peoples and settler colonial cultures, and how it is that we can help with the process of resurgence of Indigenous ways of life. So there's a lot that's going on. A couple of projects that are close to my heart. One is the Nutsamat Forage Forest, which is a project of the Galiano Conservancy Association in British Columbia, Canada, and the Penelakut First Nation. It's a clear-cut forest, not so dissimilar to the one we're in right now, different species, but same idea. It was clear-cut fairly recently, and the Conservancy wanted to restore the forest and try to get it back to some semblance of what it was, but in partnership with the Penelakut began to think about how it is that the restoration project could benefit the Penelakut in terms of plants for materials and food and medicines, and how it can be a learning space for this. So it's a kind of, this is unusual hybrid project where it's not an orthodox restoration project, it's not an orthodox, if there is such thing, cultural project, but it's actually a coming together and an infusion of these interests. And I see that kind of project as immensely hopeful because it gives, it breathes new life into how we think about restoration and how we can connect with matters of social justice in restoration. So that's one example. That's a difficult question, and it's been a complicated path over the last 2 decades with trying to provide good guidance for restoration practitioners. People are out there doing the work, and the Society for Ecological Restoration started with its primer, which I think provided very helpful information for quite a while. I mean, it was a good place to start. But there were lots of flaws in it too, and we started to see those flaws more prominently in the lack of attention to the social and cultural realities of the lived experience of restoration. We started to see it in terms of the lack of awareness of climate change. So that guidance was kind of ragged at the edges, about a decade after it came out. In Canada, we undertook a separate process which led to the first ever national level principles and guidelines anywhere in the world. They were published in 2008. And we tried, I don't know, I sort of lost to memory, and maybe my colleagues who were working on it will remember it more clearly, but I think we stumbled onto the idea that what we really need is to, because of the diversity of ecosystems and the diversity of cultural practices within Canada, that we couldn't do a one-size-fits-all approach to restoration. We couldn't say, this is what restoration is and this is how you should practice it. Instead, we said, well, what are the broad principles upon which everyone can agree restoration is about? And so we said, okay, it has to be effective, efficient, and engaging. And this tied in really nicely with the policies of our national parks organization, Parks Canada, and those guidelines took life and were implemented in diverse ways across the country. It led also to the first international, it's a little hard to say, but I think the first international body that took up restoration guidance, and that was the World Commission on Protected Areas, which is a part of the IUCN, and we developed, again, a team of people led by Canadians who undertook a consultation with people from, I think it was 17 countries, Global South, Global North, over a 2-year period, vetted those ideas a lot, and came up with the same kind of model because it seemed to work for people, whether you were restoring mangroves or desert ecosystems or mountaintops or whatever it is that you're focused on. And so this principles-based approach really seemed to work. And they were backstopped by guidelines, so each principle had more detailed guidelines, and they then were anchored by an account of how you do restoration, so what's the kind of general approach you take to any restoration project, and then really good examples of how restoration gets done. So that was kind of took us up to 2012. The Society for Ecological Restoration, which partnered in that document actually, wanted to provide what they viewed as more universal guidance. And they came up with a standards document for standards for restoration in 2016, which turned out to be a bit controversial. They borrowed quite directly from the Australian standards, which had just come out. And it was sort of taking a different approach to how you give guidance about restoration. So rather than being principles-based, it was based on specific things that, expectations, performance-based standards in effect for restoration. I was concerned about that, and a number of former SCR leaders and others were concerned about it too. And we wrote an article that was a bit controversial, but I think it helped to push for a revised, it contributed to a revised set of guidance that SCR put out in 2019, and that was then called Principles and Standards for Ecological Restoration. So that was a step in I think in a good direction. I can speak more about that, but let's not in terms of the details and how that works out. The one concern I have about the way that the principles approach is being adopted now is that it's become so complicated. So if you look at SCR's 2019 guidance, there's now 8 principles. It's not clear how those are cohere together, how they connect. And then now with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, there's 10 principles, and I'm not sure how they were evolved exactly. They don't resonate, to my mind, with how restoration gets practiced. So it's a bit complicated right now trying to figure it all out. So much, evidently. We have major global commitments and challenges in place already. So the Bond Challenge, for example, which has high and demanding targets. We have frameworks like the Land Degradation Neutrality Framework of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So these are embedding restoration ideas right into how it is that we move forward. And then, of course, the UN Decade is kind of bringing together elements of all of these into a single place. So I'd like to think that good guidance matters, and I don't know, we're working on some new strategies in Canada. We'll see whether they're helpful to anyone else, but they'll certainly be helpful to us around simplifying guidance, but we'll leave that matter alone. We need to understand more. We need to step up on our science, and I don't mean necessarily only in a narrow, natural scientific way, but we need to be doing more and better systematic work on understanding what is effective in restoration, what works, what doesn't. It's not a terribly hypothesis-driven science, so it's a bit tricky to figure out how it is that we can derive really great, replicable information about what what counts as good and effective restoration. We do know too that we need to push up our understanding of social research too. What matters for people? How are people engaged and how do they stay engaged with restoration projects? How do you fund restoration projects adequately? How do you seek effectively the political license for being able to do this kind of work, and so on? And those questions it's gratifying 20 years later to see more of that work out there, but it's far from being enough. And we need to be able to understand and work with traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local peoples to be able to realize there's a lot of different kinds of knowledge that inform how it is that we think about nature, about the other than human world, and how restoration contributes to it. Well, that's the science part. We need a big upscaling in how we train people. So there are university-based programs, college-based programs around the world. Most of them are small. A few of them are gaining strength and size. We need training for people at all different levels as well. We need training for already established professionals who are mobilizing restoration activity and they haven't done it before. So we need that kind of thing. And we need to be able to provide community resources and community toolkits to be able to do restoration at that ground level. I'm hoping that we can be much better at mobilizing restoration in support of sustainable livelihoods and social justice, to ensure that restoration efforts and the resources required to do them are shared equitably. So this is a big commitment. I think that's what the UN Decade will help with enormously, I'm hoping. So many other things. Just trying to think of what else. I mean, we could be, I'm hoping that we can continue to hold on to restoration as authentic community practice, which is where I think restoration began, in humanly scaled communities who cared about a place that had been damaged and rallied together to make it happen, whether that involves professionals or not. And I'm hoping that restoration will evolve not to be just large scale in the sense of big, big projects, but actually a million smaller projects that are really dazzling and make the lives of people and communities better, and that improvement in ways of life will contribute to sustaining restoration.